אוקיי.
אז עכשיו רק אני אומרת גם, שנייה לפני שאני משחררת, שיש כתוביות.
נכון.
אסף, אתה יכול להתחיל להקליד את מה שאנחנו אומרים. אסף קלדרון איתנו, הוא מקליד לנו והוא יתרגם את הדברים לאנגלית. אז אני רק אומרת שאם אתם רוצים לראות, אתם צריכים לאפשר ללחוץ על ה-CC למטה ולאפשר לעצמכם כתוביות. אני גם ארשום את זה בצ'אט. בהצלחה.
אוקיי. So I'll introduce you briefly, Michel, and then the stage is yours. טוב לכולם, שלום, כיף לראות אתכם. אנחנו היום מאוד שמחים לארח את דוקטור מישל בליק. הוא מרצה בכיר לפסיכולוגיה מאוניברסיטת באנגליה, וחוקר מוח וחוקר קול שלנו עובד מערכות העצביות שמשפיעות על הקול שלנו והתקשורת, וגם איך הקול והמערכות המוחיות משפיעות על הפרעות בדיבור. ואנחנו שמחים ונרגשים לארח אותו כל יום אצלנו, ותודה לאסף קלדרון המתרגם שלנו שילווה אותנו היום והנגיש לנו את ההרצאה. דוקטור מישל בליק, so lovely to have you with us this evening. We would be we really want to know what makes brains do all this. It will be super interesting.
Let's share my slide. Then you can all see that. Is that good? Yeah, I'll trust that you can see that. That's fine. You let me know if that's not right. Yes, so I'm Dr. Michel Belick, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Edge Hill University. And thank you very much for having me here. So what you'll notice probably quite quickly is that I'm not a person who stutters. I'm also not a speech language therapist, right? So my credentials in this space are actually quite limited. What I am is a neuroscientist who's really interested in speech and how we can speak at all, because it's a fascinating thing that our species does. And stuttering for me is a really interesting case of the brain doing something different. And that's where we have a really great opportunity to learn about how the brain works. So that's where I'm coming at this from. So for this talk, I'm not going to, for a different audience, I would give some context for what stammering is, etc. For this audience, I'm not going to fluent explain stammering to you. You guys know more about how that works than I do. So instead, I'm going to focus a lot on the neuroscience, and I'm going to do it in a way that assumes very little prior knowledge to make this really accessible. That's my goal. I'm also going to try to keep myself to time so that you guys have a chance to ask me questions afterwards. I think that's really important. So if I rush past something and you didn't get it or you want to talk about that more, just let me know afterwards and we'll circle back and we'll do a bit more. So I know where you guys
just a minute, Dr. Balick, sorry to interrupt you, but if you can slow down a little bit because we need to translate you live. Okay.
Sure, fair enough.
Thank you.
That's fair enough. Thank you. And do interrupt me if I get going fast again, because I can get excited and just shoot off. So that's good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Will the slide advance? That's what I need. There we go. Right. So I know where all of you are. It's only fair that you know where I am. So I'm in the UK, in the general vicinity of Liverpool, best known for the Beatles, but most recently, host of Eurovision, where I actually had the opportunity to see Israel's, yes, exactly. I got to see that act in person, actually. It was a really, really nice show. So that was great. Thank you very much for her. The plan for today is we're going to try and go through this in sort of 5 parts. We'll do some basic stuff about how the brain talks, so how communication works inside the brain. Some basics about how you talk. Apologies to the SLTs in the room. That will be obvious stuff to you, but I think it's good context for us to put on the table. We'll put some of that together into a bigger picture about how your brain makes you talk. And all of that is going to be kind of build up so we can talk about why it is that some brains stutter. And the very last part is going to be mostly a prompt for you guys to tell me about how scientists should be approaching this. So I'll give you sort of one plan that I have, but I think it's really important that we get input from the community so that you guys can help to steer the research. So that's going to be sort of a prompt for you guys to think about where this should be going in the future. Okay? Right, brain basics. Your brain is very slightly like a computer. Not a lot like a computer, right? This is an analogy, and all analogies are wrong. It's just that some of them are useful. So this brain is like a computer analogy can be a little useful to the extent that computers are made of wires and resistors. If you arrange these wires and resistors in just the right way, you get a circuit, right? It computes something, it does something with information. And if you get enough of these circuits put together in just the right way, it makes a network. And it does a job, something that we find useful. So that's going to be a way that we're going to approach this brain business. Your brain is made of neurons. Science didn't always know this. Your entire body is made of cells. For a while, we didn't know if the brain was made of cells. People thought it might be like a sponge or a mesh or something. It's not. It's just more cells, like the entire body is. So what you're seeing on this slide is actually some of the oldest pictures of brain cells, neurons, that science has. So these are the drawings of Santiago Ramón y Cajal, a Spanish neuroscientist who first described the neuron. So he would take brain tissue, look at it under a microscope, and he would draw these lovely pictures of the neurons that he saw. And you can see they come in a really lovely diversity of shapes and sizes and orientations and connections. There's all different kinds of good stuff in there. And so the particular details of which neurons are firing when and how they're connected to each other are going to do something to determine what roles they fill in your brain. Now, those are our oldest pictures. We have much more advanced imaging technology now that we use to study neuroscience. So some of that will look very beautiful, like the sort of artified images on this slide that are very fanciful. Others will look a little more utilitarian, basic, but their job is to measure something about brain function. So there's sometimes we have these nice aesthetic images, sometimes we have more scientific images for measurement. Okay. Right, so what are these neurons? These neurons are cells, like your entire body. They're composed of what we call a cell body and an axon. So the cell body is actually the boring bits. It has all the stuff in it that all cells have to keep them alive. It has a nucleus that contains your DNA. So that's the entire instructions for running your body. It has ribosomes, which know how to translate messages from the DNA into proteins, which do jobs inside the cell to make it operate. Lysosomes, mitochondria, things that contribute to the sort of energy economy that keeps the cell going. The boring biology stuff. None of that is special about a neuron. It's just some stuff that all the cells have to have. What's special about the neuron is that it has dendrites and axons. We can think of dendrites as kind of like the ear of the axon. So that's how it's going to receive information from other parts of the brain. And the axon is kind of like the voice of the neuron. That's going to be how it transmits information to other parts of the brain. We don't like to look at individual neurons alone because neurons are chatty. The whole point of them is that they should receive signals, do something with them, and send them to other neurons because they're part of a circuit that has to do some computation. That's sort of the point. So here we have, this is the axon from the previous slide here, and you can see that it's going out to this sort of blue neuron and making some connections. It also goes to another neuron that's kind of off the slide here. So neurons are very chatty. Their job is to talk to each other, to do something. And they actually talk to lots of neurons. So here we can see our orange neuron that we're looking at is receiving signals on its dendrite from lots of different neurons. It's sending signals out through its axon to lots of different neurons. And these might be talking to each other. So again, they form some kind of a circuit. And they're not, is this right? And so they're not just attached to each other, but they have a signaling mechanism. So here, if we look at these two neurons on the left, the top one is sending an axon down, so it's going to send a signal to the bottom one. The way this works is that it's going to send an electrical signal through its axon. And you can see it's actually got these pink bits here. I'm going to go back because I skipped it. Here we go. This axon has a sheath around it made of myelin, which is basically just a kind of fat. If you think of also the way that, we'll go back to this, to wires, right? Wires often have like a little plastic sheath around it. So that's kind of what's happening with this axon. It's got a little sheet of fat around it. And this is useful because it makes electrical signals go way faster through this axon, right? So some of these signals have to travel quite a distance through your brain. You don't want a lot of lag going from one part of the brain to the other. You want it to go fast. And so these sheaths kind of help signals move more quickly along an axon so they can get to another part of the brain. Now, once the signal gets down to the end of this axon here, you get to the synapse. So that's sort of where one axon attaches to another. They don't quite touch, they just sort of get very, very close. And there's a little space between them. And the way that this is going to work is once our top neuron here sends its signal down, it reaches the synapse. That synapse is going to release some chemicals called neurotransmitters. So neuro because neurons, transmitters because they're transmitting a signal from one neuron to another. And actually, you've probably heard of some of these neurotransmitters before. So these are chemicals like dopamine, which you might have heard in the context of reward or addiction, or serotonin, which you might have heard of in the context of mood or depression, things like that, right? So that's one of the main things that that antidepressants act on is actually serotonin. So you probably have some idea what those are about. Right, those neurotransmitters are going to be taken up by the postsynaptic neuron, so the second neuron here. And if it gets enough of the right kinds of neurotransmitters, it's going to send a signal downstream and so on. Okay, so we've looked at now small numbers of these neurons individually, but your brain is composed of billions of these neurons, billions. And because each of them sends signals to so many other neurons, that means that you actually have trillions of these synapses. So if you had 1 shekel for every synapse that you have in your brain, you would be probably one of the richest people on the planet, right? Probably not that lucky, alas, but at least you've got lots of synapses, so that's nice. That's it. You've successfully passed brain basics. Congratulations. We're going to put the brain stuff aside for just a moment and talk about speech. We'll get back to the brain stuff in a moment, I promise. Okay, speech basics. And again, apologies to our speech and language people. Some of this will be familiar to you. So the muscles involved in speaking are very complicated. There's a lot of them. Most of them are very small and tiny. They do small but important movements. We typically like to break these down into 3 pieces. We've got the lungs, which produce mechanical power for speaking, right? So that's just going to make air whoosh. That's the technical term, whoosh, up the airway. That air is going to reach the larynx, which is basically just a pair of membranes that sit in the airway. Air that is whooshing through them will make them vibrate. And so that's going to produce the sound of your voice. If they vibrate quickly, you're making a high pitch. If they vibrate slowly, you're making a low pitch. Okay, but that on its own doesn't communicate very much information. You're also going to need to make some speech sounds. So those vibrating sounds produced by your larynx will pass through your vocal tract, so the space inside your throat and your mouth. And depending on what your articulatory muscles are doing, the articulators, so things like your pharynx, your lips, your tongue, depending on what position they've taken, they're going to make a special shape inside your mouth. And that's going to amplify some frequencies or dampen other frequencies. And depending on which combination of frequencies you've amplified or dampened, that's going to become a speech sound. So here, if we take that system again, right? Respiration, larynx, articulator, you have the lungs contracting, that produces turbulent air movement. So you've got similar, roughly equal energy across all frequencies, basically just noise, right? There's no information encoded in this. That reaches your larynx, that's going to start vibrating. So now you won't just have noise, but you'll have frequencies encoded in your flow of air. So that means you'll have vibrations at some frequencies. So the bottom one here that's labeled F0 is the frequency of your voice. So for example, right now, I'm mostly making pitch sounds at about 100 hertz. So if we looked at my recordings of my speech, you'd find lots of vibrations at 100 hertz, but also a bunch at integer multiples of that, 200, 300, 400, so on. And that would allow someone to hear the pitch of my voice. Now, this profile of vibration is going to filter up through the articulators and be amplified or dampened. So some frequencies will get dampened, others will get amplified. So we can see that here. So here's the parts labeled F1, F2, F3. So that's the first formant, second formant, third formant are frequency bands that are amplified by, let's say, for example, one particular configuration of the vocal tract. And together, those will encode one speech sound. If my lips and tongue were in a slightly different position, we would get slightly different combinations of formants, and you would then hear a different speech sound. I always think these things are easier in pictures. So here's the same kind of thing, but with a bit of an image. So this is an MRI image, magnetic resonance imaging, of one person while they're speaking. So here, this is a person facing to the left, right? That's their nose. Here's their lips. This whole great big gray space is their tongue, and it's the larynx down there. What we're interested in is actually the empty space inside, right? Because the shape of this space is going to determine which frequencies are amplified and which ones are dampened. That's going to encode a speech sound in the physical air leaving your vocal tract, which then someone else's ear is going to hear and decode into the speech sound that you intend. So on the right here, you can see this same person making 2 different speech sounds. So this is the sound ah, as in bard, on the top. you can see that their tongue, this great big spot here, is smashed back into the throat. And so they've got a very small space in the throat and a large space up towards the front of the mouth. Same person saying the sound E, as in bead. The tongue is forward and up towards the roof of the mouth. So you've got a big space in the back, a small space in the front. And so these spaces are going to resonate different kinds of frequencies, which is going to encode different information in the physical acoustics of your voice, which someone else will then hear as a speech sound. So your brain's job is to figure out just the right combination of movements of these articulators so that you produce the speech sounds that you intend to produce, so that you say the message that you want to say. There you go, crash course through speech. We can go back to brains now because I think it's given us enough context. Right, so I want to zoom out here. We were looking at individual neurons, and I want us to start putting some neurons together and to make a brain, okay? Yes, there's a brain. Your brain is composed of two kinds of tissue, gray matter and white matter. But it's actually a bit deceptive to call those two different kinds of tissues because they're really the same cells. Gray matter just happens to be where we find the cell bodies for our neurons. White matter just happens to be where we find lots and lots of axons, particularly axons that have these myelin sheaths, these fatty sheaths on the outside. So the reason white matter is white is because it's got lots of axon, which is made of fat, and fat is white. It literally, if you look at it, it's white because it's made of fat, right? We're not very creative as scientists, usually we just call it how we see it. So if we were to take some individual neurons, like these ones on the left here in our Petri dish, right? They have cell bodies, these bulbs, axons, the spindles. If we were to put those in our little brain here, we would find the cell bodies in gray matter and the axons in white matter. Okay, so far so good. Now we can start to take that brain and break it into smaller pieces so that we can understand how it's going to work. The sort of biggest division we can look at is hemispheres. You have a left hemisphere, you have a right hemisphere. You've probably encountered this myth before that the left hemisphere has something to do with logic and the right hemisphere has something to do with creativity. Fortunately, I have to bust that myth for you. That's not based in anything in science. It's just something that pop culture seems to like this idea and it floats around a lot. Social media likes to perpetuate this. Don't really even know where it came from. It's just an idea that's around and not particularly true. That said, there are some differences between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And for our purposes today, they're actually really important. One of them is that the left part of the brain tends to control the right half of the body, and the right half tends to control the left half of the body. Okay? The other, of course, is that for most people, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, does most of the heavy lifting for anything to do with language and speech. So here I've listed phonetics, that's making the speech sounds for your language, semantics, combining the speech sounds into words that mean something, and syntax, combining those words in a grammatically useful order, right? So that the order of the words influences the meaning. Dog bites man means something different than man bites dog, for example. The right hemisphere also has some things that it specializes in, but that's sort of less important for us today. We can break each of those hemispheres down into lobes. So here I've listed 4 lobes for you. They're kind of color-coded. So the parietal lobe in red, it has to do with spatial reasoning, body sense. It receives signals actually from your skin, from your muscles, from your joints. So it has lots of information about the state of your body. Physically, where is it? What loads are you holding? What angles are your joints? The kind of information that you'd want to know if you're going to plan some movements. The occipital lobe receives information from your eyes and processes that information so that you can see. The temporal lobe in yellow here receives information from the ear and processes it so that you can hear. It also uses that information for language, maybe unsurprisingly. And the frontal lobe here, which is this great big blue one, has to do with thought, planning, and especially movement, actually. So those other three lobes are all about receiving information from the external world and then processing it to make that external information useful to the brain. The frontal lobe is going to be about planning what to do with that information and then acting on it, making your body actually do something, right? Because if all you do is receive lots and lots of info, that's great, but you probably want to use that information to act on your environment. That's what the frontal lobe is going to do. That's still a pretty coarse scope, so we can zoom in even further. This is by now quite an old map, 1909, but it's still a useful one. And so this map breaks all those lobes into about a few dozen brain areas. And so Brodmann, the guy who drew this map, observed that different parts of the brain have different combinations of different kinds of neurons. Remember when we looked at Cahal earlier, we saw that there are lots of different kinds of neurons. So it turns out that each of these parts of the brain has either different kinds of neurons or different ratios of kinds of neurons, or they're connected to each other in different ways. And this is going to change something about how they function. To give you an example, because that feels a bit abstract, in orange here we have auditory cortex. Its job is to receive signals from the ear. So there's a sound in your environment, it vibrates a little membrane in your ear, there's some other steps in between, but eventually that information arrives here in the orange area. And it actually contains a physical spatial map of the frequencies that you're hearing. So if you hear a low-pitched sound, neurons in one part of auditory cortex will start to fire. They'll start to process that sound to do something with it. If you hear a high-pitched sound, you get neurons in the other side of this map starting to fire and doing something with that information. Okay, so this is going to be a physical map, physical spatial map of the sounds around you. The signals being processed in auditory cortex will get fed on to some other part of the brain that does something more complicated, and so on to more and more complicated processes until eventually it's decoded those sounds into speech so that you can understand it. We can, after that, get much more specific. Remember, that was 1909, more than 100 years ago. We've progressed a little bit since then. We have lots of new technology. We don't necessarily have to fuss with that too much today. That's just to flag up that there is a deeper rabbit hole we could dive down to if we needed to. We don't need to do that today. So we're going to step back from going any further in. Because these brain areas are actually a useful level for us to talk about. For example, to give you a couple more, right beside auditory cortex is Wernicke's area, whose job is to understand what words mean. Right? So you hear words, that's decoded by auditory cortex. It's eventually going to send some signals to Wernicke's area, which is going to try and decode what those words mean. Right? So now you've understood something that has been told to you. Eventually, it ends up sending signals out to Broca's area, which actually has a job more like phonetics. So if I wanted to say those words back, what kinds of sounds do I need to make? What kinds of gestures do I need to make in order to reproduce those sounds? And let's say I actually want to do it. I might send that kind of information up to motor cortex, which has the specific job of moving your muscles, right? So it's going to know exactly what the state of your muscles are now, what state they have to be in to produce the sequence of speech sounds that say what you want to say, and how to get from where we are to where we need to be. That's going to be its job. What I've kind of implied there is that these brain areas don't work alone. They work in networks, right? So this is our best understanding currently of the network that we use to speak. This is the speech network. according to the DIVA model, which is our best model at the time. So each of these boxes is a brain area, and the arrows are sort of connections between the brain areas. We don't need to unpack this too much, just maybe to say that there's, on the left here, we have a feed forward system. So that's basically just a system that's going to execute your intentions. You have something that you want to accomplish, and this is going to be the part that tries to make those movements happen, to make those sounds happen. And on the right, you have a feedback system sort of in blue here. Its job is to listen to what you've actually said and also to monitor signals coming from your muscles to see whether what you intended to do is what you actually did. And it's going to feed that back so that you can make some corrections as you go. And maybe also learn how to execute those movements more smoothly in the future, right? So it's both for smoothing things out as we go and for learning, basically. It's a learning system. And just to reinforce that these brain areas are physical spaces in your brain. So each of these boxes has an actual location in the brain, right? It's got a geography. I want to make that a little more concrete by looking at one network in particular, which is going to be really important for us today, which is the motor network. I'm going to focus us specifically here on motor cortex, which we did see a few slides ago. So that's this red box here in the network. We can see it as this red stripe in the brain on the left here. So this is motor cortex. Its job is to execute movements. If motor cortex fires, part of your body will move. No longer a choice, it's going to happen. If for some reason motor cortex is unable to fire, then your body is not going to move. Again, not an option, right? So it's really important for controlling your body. Something that's really interesting with it too is it has actually a spatial map of your body, or at least of the kinds of movements your body can make. So for example, I've sort of drawn this, I've got this cartoon smeared across the surface here. So movements that involve your feet tend to be driven by neurons at the top of this map, movements involving your hands, the middle, and about the bottom half or bottom third are movements to do with your face, which is a lot, right? Like your face and neck and throat is a relatively small amount of the muscle in your body, but it gets a huge amount of real estate in your brain because, well, they're probably really important, but also they're really small, dexterous muscles, right? They need to be controlled with very fine detail. And so the brain has to devote a lot of resources to making sure that they get moved with just the right combination of finesse, right? They're finesse muscles. Okay. The other thing that makes motor cortex really cool is it has the biggest axons in the body. And in this case, bigger actually is better because it means that it transmits signals very, very fast, which makes sense, right? Because by the time we get to motor cortex, we've decided what we want to do or say, and now it's just a matter of getting your body to actually respond. In which case, you probably want really fast latencies, right? You don't want to be waiting a long time between what you've decided to do and the body actually doing it. You want that to be about instantaneous. So you get these great big giant axons that send lightning fast signals down to a set of specialized nuclei in the brainstem or the spine. And each of these has only the job of sending axons down to specific muscles, right? So if we took the face part of motor cortex, it's going to send some of these really big axons down to this facial nucleus, and it's going to send axons down to muscles in the face. So if we look at the right here, I've got this panel labeled neuromuscular junction. That just means where we see a joining of neurons and muscle, right? Big word, but it's an easy meaning. Sometimes, again, we're not that creative as scientists. So here we've got a neuron coming down and it's going to synapse not on another neuron. Instead, it's going to synapse on a muscle. So rather than communicating a signal be processed, it's going to communicate a really simple command, which is that this muscle should contract now, get shorter. And that's the only thing that muscles can do, actually. The only thing that muscles can do is contract, which is going to pull and create force on one of your joints. So that when you move, what you're actually doing is that your brain has chosen some really specific combination of muscle fibers to contract by a really specific amount, and that's going to move some joint or some part of your body in a way that you find useful. And that's motor cortex's job, basically, is to figure out what that combination is, send signals to just the right set of these little nuclei so that they make just the right set of muscle fibers contract to do the movement that you intended to do. Right. We're almost done with my big picture of brains. But before we wrap that part, I want to talk about how we get pictures of brains, sort of our modern way of doing neuroscience, because it's going to be important for understanding how we study stammering. Because I promise we are still getting to the stammering stuff. So at the top here, this is a magnetic resonance imaging machine, an MRI. It's a very, very strong magnet. You put someone's head in there and we can take pictures. The reason that we can use it to take pictures is because of a really kind of odd quirk about our blood, actually. So your blood contains white blood cells and red blood cells. The white blood cells are about immune system stuff. We're going to put those aside. The red blood cells have the job of taking oxygen from your lungs to the different parts of your body that need it. And your brain needs a ton of oxygen. It's a very, very expensive organ. As a species, we've invested a lot in our brains, and it takes a lot of our calories. It takes a lot of our oxygen. So lots and lots of blood goes to the brain. And it turns out that part of these red blood cells contains a molecule called hemoglobin. This is the shape of hemoglobin. I'm not a chemist. I don't understand what most of the shape means. I don't expect you to understand what most of the shape means. What we do need to care about is that right in the middle, this atom Fe is iron. Iron is ferromagnetic. If you put it in a great big magnet, it interferes with magnetic field, and we can measure that. That's a physical quantity. So if we get enough activity going in part of your brain, lots of neurons firing, they need lots of oxygen. Your body's set up to supply it. Good, you need lots of oxygen. Lots of oxygen is going to come. It's going to come with lots of hemoglobin, with lots of iron. And that's going to disrupt the magnetic field in a very specific place in your brain. So we can use that. So if we put someone in an MRI scanner, we can have them do an experiment where they engage in some kind of cognitive process that's interesting to us. Maybe that's solving a math problem. Maybe that's speaking. Maybe that's speaking in a way that's likely to make them stammer. Okay, so we can look at what the brain is doing when that behavior is happening, what the brain is doing when it's not happening, and see the difference. Where are the parts of the brain where we see some change in the magnetic field? Because that means that lots of oxygen is going there. That means that lots of neurons are firing. So something interesting is happening. And we end up getting these sort of colorized images. So on the top here, in grayscale, these are just anatomical pictures, right? So that's just anatomy. It doesn't tell us anything about the function of the brain. It's just a picture so we can see which parts of the brain we're going to talk about. On the bottom here, we have these nice red colorful blobs. So these mark parts of the brain where we saw reliable changes in the magnetic field when the person was engaging in some behavior. Okay, so that's sort of our general framework these days for understanding brain function. Finally, then, we can put some of that together to try to understand what it is that causes stuttering. Spoiler, which I hope won't be too disappointing, because we don't entirely know. I'll give you some thoughts to go home with, but I don't want to present this as though it's a solved problem, because it's not. Right, so maybe unsurprisingly, you've invited a neuroscientist. You're going to get kind of a biological sort of view about where stammering comes from. So you have a set of genes. Actually, most of us have almost identical genes, 99.9 or better, exactly the same. that extra little bit, that little 0.01 that we don't share, is where we differ, right? So that's the sort of genetic variation that makes us unique individuals. Probably none of us have exactly the same genes in that little fraction, that 0.01, unless we have some identical twins, and then maybe you guys share. But the rest of us will all have unique combinations of genes in that little fraction where humans are allowed to differ. Because that big pile that's all the same is important, right? That's why we all have a brain that has the cells on the cell bodies on the outside and the axons on the inside. That's why we all have a brain that has 2 hemispheres with 4 lobes and a few dozen brain areas, and they're all wired up in more or less the same pattern. We have lots and lots of big scale commonalities that just have to be there, because otherwise you're not going to get a human, basically, right? And so those similarities occur because we have so much commonality in our genome. But what we might get is maybe some smaller differences in a specific part of the brain, maybe a slightly different mix of kinds of neurons, or slightly different connections from one brain area to another. Maybe the connection between area A and B is a little weaker, but between area A and C is a little stronger, sort of smaller differences that could then have consequences for how these brain areas work as a network. And no, of course, that's not to say that life experiences aren't going to matter, because a big point of having such a lovely big brain is that we should be able to learn, so it can adapt to our environments. And so, of course, life experience is going to have a fairly major role in how your brain works as well. We shouldn't ignore that. But together, those things combine to make a brain, and that brain is going to entirely determine your behavior. In our case today, that behavior is stuttering. So the reason I've talked about all of that is because I wanted to prepare us to talk about this next part. So what I'm going to show you is a meta-analysis, so a study of studies, where I have gone out and I've collected all the different brain imaging studies that people have done on stuttering and kind of put them together to look at what are the findings, what are the findings that keep coming up reliably again and again across studies. And in order to do this, I find it useful to talk about stuttering in 2 ways. So I'm going to talk about state stuttering and trait stuttering. What I mean by that is we can talk about stuttering as a state, as in something that sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't, right? So a person who stutters doesn't always stutter. Sometimes there's fluent speech. And so we can look at, within the same person, we can look at a difference in behavior, the stutter manifesting or the stutter not manifesting. And that could be interesting. We could also look at between people. We can compare the brains of people who sometimes stutter with the brains of people who are not prone to stuttering. So we can do that when everyone's fluent here as well, right? So here now the behavior is the same, fluent speech in a brain that happens to stutter sometimes, fluent speech in a brain that mostly doesn't stutter. So here the behavior is the same, but the brain is different, right? Different population. Or here for the state, the same brain, but a different behavior. So 2 different complementary ways that we can look at what's going on. Right, so here's the big slide. Lots of brain, lots of names, lots of acronyms. Don't panic, we're going to break some of this apart to make it a little more digestible. What we're seeing here, so all the gray stuff are just anatomical pictures of a brain. These are horizontal slices. So if you start on the right here, you're sort of at the top of the brain, and then as we go to the left, we're slicing down and down and down, okay? The top row is going to be about trait stuttering, so differences between populations. So this is when speech is fluent, comparing brains that are prone to stutter and brains that are not prone to stutter. The bottom is state stuttering. So within the same brains, within your brains, what happens when the stutter occurs and what happens when the stutter does not occur. Right. So lots and lots of things happening here. We're going to start to pick this apart. Direct your attention towards these slices in green here, especially here if we look at larynx motor cortex in trait stuttering here. We can see that, oh yeah, and also orange means more brain activation. So we observed that more oxygen was going to that part of the brain, which means the neurons were doing more work. And blue means less activation. So less oxygen coming there, the neurons probably doing less work. So here we see in larynx motor cortex, in the left hemisphere, this sort of blue patch means that the neurons there are doing a little less work in people who stutter than in our sort of fluent controls in these experiments. Whereas the right hemisphere, the same brain area, is doing extra work. And this is a bit odd, actually, because that larynx, it's a symmetrical structure, right? It's not supposed to do different things on the two sides. It's supposed to do the same thing on both sides all the time. And so usually we would see both of these sides going step in step, doing the same thing. But here in the brain of a person who stutters, even when they're speaking fluently, you start to see an asymmetry with the right side doing a little more work than the left. And now if we go down to state stuttering, we can see actually there's a further increase in the right hemisphere larynx motor cortex when the person stutters. So you have this asymmetry that's already sort of there. It's not there in the fluent controls. And then at the moment of stuttering, it's exacerbated. It gets a little more extreme. And this might be part of what's now triggering the stutter. And remember that this is motor cortex. Its job is to make muscles contract. And so here you have a brain area whose job is to make muscles contract. It's not as maybe coordinated between the two sides of the body as we would normally expect. And at the moment that the stutter happens, this is getting a bit more extreme. So something's a bit different. Also, if you see right beside here, we have lip motor cortex, also extra activated at the moment of stuttering, which means that we have things going on at sort of both ends of the airway, right? Extra muscle contraction at the larynx at the bottom of the airway, extra muscle contraction at the lips at the top of the airway, which maybe starts to make a little bit of sense, right? Given the phenomenology of stuttering, as you know better than I do, and you can tell me more about. But a bit of extra muscle contraction maybe makes a little bit of sense as a mechanism, right? Now, of course, that's going to make us ask, well, all right, if extra muscle contraction is coming from motor cortex, it pretty much had to. What's making the motor cortex behave differently? Well, of course, we talked about the fact that none of these brain areas work alone; they work in networks. So here I've highlighted in green all different brain areas that are also showing us sort of brain differences in the motor network. So widespread brain differences throughout the motor network in stammering that are probably contributing to this different behavior at motor cortex. Okay, so that's going to be one of the things that's happening. And you can see actually most of these are orange, right? So most of these are the brain working overtime, this motor network working overtime, doing more than it might normally do. And so that gives us sort of some clue what's going on here, maybe some overactivity in this motor network. But that's not the only thing, right? This isn't going to be only about movement. There's a lot more happening here. So for example, I'll highlight in pink, we'll call this pink, two brain areas that are both in or near auditory cortex. We talked about auditory cortex earlier, responsible for hearing. And not actually just hearing the external world, but hearing feedback from your own speech, which seems like it could be relevant here, right? And here these are blue, so that means deactivation, so this tissue is doing less work than usual. Well, for state stuttering, less brain activation in auditory cortex, well, maybe that's not surprising, right? Our participant is stuttering, so they're not producing as much sound, maybe, as when fluent. So of course, there's less for auditory cortex to do. It's not working as hard. Okay, that's maybe not surprising. But if we look at trait stuttering, we still see that there's some reduced brain activation in auditory cortex. So it's probably not doing as, and so this is even when speaking fluently, right? So auditory cortex is maybe not doing as much to use auditory feedback as in people that aren't prone to stammer. And particularly notice that this is in the left hemisphere, which we would expect to be doing a lot of heavy lifting for speech and language. And so maybe that is going to be relevant for us. We also see brain activation increases in parts of the brain related to language, especially Broca's area. Remember that its job is to do things like speech planning, figuring out which phonemes have to go together to make the words that you want to do, and maybe start to think about which movements would have to be made in order to make those speech sounds. Particularly, we're seeing extra activation in right hemisphere Broca's area. And again, left hemisphere would be more typical for a language task. But this could still mean a couple of things. So it could mean that the brain that is prone to stammering is trying to use the right hemisphere to plan language, and the right hemisphere is just not usually as well optimized for that. And so something is, less efficient than it could be, maybe. It also could be, though, that this is a brain, like these are adults. This is a brain that has stammered for most of its life, and it's probably learned something. So maybe actually we're using right hemisphere Broca's here, not because this is problematic, but because this is somehow helpful. Maybe this is helping to mitigate some difference elsewhere in the brain, right? We have no way to tell actually whether this is part of the cause or if this is a mechanism that tries to mitigate a cause somewhere else. Sort of more research needs to happen for us to understand what that mechanism means. Right, lastly, I'll highlight a couple more here. These are parts of the brain related to emotional sort of processing. I wanted to highlight these only so that we could take them with a grain of salt, because I think there would be a temptation to see these and to make claims about temperament and stuttering, which I know there's some narrative around that. But I wouldn't want to take these ones too seriously, because think about the context that these studies happen in, right? So they're usually in a big fancy lab, often in a hospital. There's lots of people with lab coats or maybe like nurses' scrubs on. It's a very medicalized, sterile environment. People who stutter, or at least the ones I've encountered in this context, they're always super excited to be contributing to the science, and they're super engaged, really excited to do something, cool for stuttering, that we can learn about it. But then us cruel scientists are going to put them in this MRI scanner, and we're going to want to probably observe them stuttering, right? That's going to be the point, which means that we ask them to do things that are likely to make them stutter, which you're not always happy to do, right? Maybe sometimes you're happy to do it, but those are probably systematically things that people might find uncomfortable. In which case, if you put all that together, the kind of weird environment, the strange behaviors that you're going to be asked to do, and the fact that we're deliberately asking you to do, weird speech behaviors in the scanner, yeah, it's not maybe that surprising that people are feeling their feelings in that context, right? So we'll just maybe not make a big deal about the emotion stuff, because I think there's reasons why the experiment might work that way. Oh yeah, right, good. So the issue, so that was my own meta-analysis, but I'll readily say that the big issue with doing the science that way is that a meta-analysis will hide diversity. It's only going to show us things that you all have in common, or at least things that occur often in brains that stutter. It's not going to show us the diversity, which is important, because really, I would be shocked if every brain that stutters had all of these differences. These are a lot of differences. To my mind, any one or a few of these on their own might be enough to engage in stuttering. I don't know that for sure, because this method can only show us commonality. But I suspect that it maybe only takes a little bit. And part of why I suspect that is this study here. So this was a small study. It's only 4 people. But they did something really cool, which is that they showed us the data from all 4 people. And so these are, again, in grayscale anatomy of the brain. In cool colors are the data for individual participants, so your purples, blues, and greens. In hot colors, your yellow and orange and red, are the brain areas where they overlap. And I don't know about you, but I don't see a lot of hot colors. That's a lot of cold, right? That's a lot of brain areas where only one of these 4 people had some kind of a brain difference. And that's wild. So little, like a lot going on, but so little of it in common. So you see, here's a little bit in Broca's area, 2 of the participants who shared that. Here's a little bit in, this is part of the motor system, 2 of the participants shared that. There's another bit here, again, in the motor system, 2 shared that. But otherwise, all different and unique. And this is something that gets entirely hidden by the way that I and others have approached this. And I think this is a problem, and it's where I want to take the research in the future. So I'll do probably another like maybe 5 minutes or something to give you a sense of where I want to go, and then I want to hear your voices if I can. I'd really like that. So this next bit is planned work. It's not been done yet. It's where I'm going. The idea here is, yes, let's talk about differences, not defects, for brains that stutter. But I want to do this in a way where we talk about also that they're different but not random. So it can be systematic. And that means that us neuroscientists can still learn something from it, which is where I want to go. So I think to do this, we have to talk more about subtypes of stammering. Ways not just, so yes, ways that you guys are different from people who aren't prone to stutter, but also ways that you might be different among each other that we can learn a lot from. And this isn't a new idea. This has been around for a while. There have been lots of attempts to identify subtypes of stuttering. They've just not been very useful so far. And usually because they're sort of small scale. It's usually individual clinicians observing their own patients and trying to put them into piles, which is, has some use for the clinic, sure. But then if you take that same system and try to take it to another clinic with a different clinician and different patients, it doesn't work anymore. So this approach has not been very constructive so far. But I think we can do better by taking a more empirical approach. So rather than relying on personal observations of a small number of people, instead what we want is lots of data from a population. And so what we can start to do then is leverage a new trend actually in neuroscience, which is these biobanks. So rather than having, Michelle go out and spend a few dozen thousand pounds doing a really small study, and I learn a little bit of information and throw out the rest, and someone else does a small study and they learn a little bit and throw out the rest. It's very inefficient. Instead of doing that, what governments have started to do is they pool all the money they would have spent on those small studies, make one really huge study that measures huge numbers of people and measures huge numbers of variables, so that someone like me can come and say, right, can I please look in your biobank and find all the people who've had contact with the healthcare system related to stuttering? And also, may I please have their genomes and their brains, right? Because they've all been genotyped, they've all been brain imaged. So now suddenly we can get actually quite a massive sample of people who stutter without having had to have individual kind of subjective exposure that might bias how we try and subtype them. So now the question for someone like me is, can we take a big pile of data like this and using the data alone, find ways that you are not only different from people who only speak fluently, but are different from each other. And in a way that, and so this could look kind of like noise, that you're all unique and there are maybe an infinite number of ways that a brain could acquire stuttering. That would be interesting. But what I think is more likely is that maybe there are clusters of you. Maybe there's, a few or a dozen or whatever different ways that the brain could be different than usual that results in a similar kind of behavior, the stuttering, that leads you all to go to the same place, like this nice association. And maybe if we can understand how that works well enough, I really wonder whether it would start to explain ways that your sort of own lived experience of stuttering maybe differs from another person's, or maybe ways that they're the same as another person's, if you have sort of some commonalities in the system. At least that's where I want that word to go, but I'm conscious that I've spoken for quite a long time now. I hope I didn't go too fast for our translator. I do get excited. But yes, so we have done quite a lot also in the last 75 minutes. We've talked about basic neuroscience about how neurons work, basics about how your muscles control speech. We've put that together into how your brain organizes speech generally. We talked about how that could be a bit different in people who stutter, and a little taste of where I want to go. But now, one, thank you all very much for listening. I would like to turn this over to questions, if we may, or comments. Those are fine too, because I really want to hear from you guys about what you, well, first, anything that you want me to circle back to explain again if I went too fast, or any inputs you think about what the science has done well, what it maybe hasn't done well, or where you'd like it to go. Also, if you don't get a chance to ask a question or you have some comment that you want, that you still want to make afterwards, there's a survey sort of here that you can fill out. So then at least that way you'll be heard. Okay, thank you very much. I will now stop talking.
Thank you so much, Michel, for this comprehensive overview. I think we will stop the recording and